Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Air Sea Fluxes from Space webinar series. Today we have Jamie Shutler from the University of Exeter, who's going to talk about satellite observations and the prospects for using them to understand shelf sea carbon accumulation rates. Take it away, Jamie.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. So, trying to get to the button where it says
Right, we can see it, but there, perfect.
Right, so thank you. So my name is Jamie Shutler. I'm from the University of Exeter in the UK. And I'm going to talk a bit about some of my work, but also that of my research group. So Daniel, Jenny, and Stouge, who are listed here, as some of this is also their work as well. And I wanted to kind of highlight the role that satellite observations are playing within assessing the ocean carbon sink and ocean carbon and carbon globally, but also to show some early work that we've done for understanding shelf sea carbon accumulation, which is we're also using lots of satellite observations for. So I wanted to start with highlighting Eunice. Eunice was her early work in the 1800s. She was actually the first person to identify the properties of greenhouse gases. So this was about 2 or 3 years ahead of John Tyndall's work in the UK, and she showed experimentally why we should be studying carbon dioxide and the carbon cycle. And I always like to highlight this the film, which was made about her life and her experiences as a scientist, because when she was involved in research in her early work, she wasn't actually able to present her work because women weren't considered able or to perform any research. And so her work was actually presented by male colleagues, which her work did predate that of John Tyndall's in identifying experimentally the properties of greenhouse gas. And then I also wanted to kind of put it into that kind of understanding into context. So this is Venus on the left, and this is the Earth on the right, clearly. And they're about the same size, roughly, and they're about the same distance from the Sun. And Venus is our closest neighbor in that sense. But the amount of carbon between these two planets is near identical. They have about the same amount of carbon total within their system. But the difference with Venus is it has a runaway climate, and all the carbon is in fact airborne. So therefore, greenhouse gases are really taking a hold and have a huge impact. But the difference with Earth is, even though we're about the same size, same distance from the Sun, receiving approximately the same amount of energy, same amount of carbon within the system, but Earth has a huge amount of water. And so the key thing here is the fact that water is helping us to regulate that carbon process. And how hence we end up with the environment and the climate we enjoy currently. And the reason for that is why ocean carbon, quantifying ocean carbon for global assessments is so important. And this has become fairly routine now, the exploitation of satellite observations for doing this. And they rely heavily on in situ data. So on the left here, these are example cruise tracks of collecting in situ gaseous amounts of carbon dioxide within the water, so the particle pressure of CO2 and these are data across the Atlantic. And then satellite observations are routinely used to interpolate these into complete fields of concentration of the gas within the water. And then again, satellite observations are used to then turn those concentrations in the water and in the atmosphere into actual calculations of the flux, the flow between the atmosphere and the ocean. And this extensively uses satellite salinity, temperature, sea state, and ocean color data in synergy. And the majority of the assessments within the global carbon budget, for example, all rely heavily on satellite observations. And we shouldn't underestimate the kind of importance of this approach, because if this is actually here is a list of all the different groups and data sets which are contributed to the annual carbon budgets, which are used to guide policy decisions. So on the left, we have all the sources of gas, of carbon, and on the right, we have our where we think they all partition into the atmosphere, ocean and land components. And clearly, the ones at the bottom are where satellite observations and ocean observations are used heavily, because these are the ocean-based database products estimating the ocean carbon sink. And in fact, all of those methods use satellite observations. Within the ocean models, which are also used to assess the ocean carbon assessment, some of those also use satellite observations for driving those models or as quality control constraints. And then, rather oddly, the land estimates of carbon also rely on estimates of the ocean carbon sink. And they either use that in terms of fundamental input to their modeling approaches, or they use it as a quality control measure on the resultant land carbon estimates that come out from that modeling. And then within this process, these budgets, they use an atmospheric inversion approach to look at the residual, so clearly the ocean carbon components, which are again derived from those satellite observations, are used within that part of the assessment. So that means all of those steps within the global carbon budget assessments, which are used to guide policy, rely upon satellite observations and ocean observations. So that's kind of their importance. Their global level, regional level is no different. This is a study which was funded by the UK government to look at the European shelf seas. All these lines are the cruise track and individual in situ data samples that were used within that assessment. And again, satellite observations were used to intelligently interpolate them, and then again to calculate the gas fluxes in the exchange between the water and the atmosphere. And this led to policy advice highlighting that clearly the most important thing we can do for helping shelf seas was about reducing global emissions, and then the impacts of and the control of biology and nutrients going in the water is more of a secondary process, but also clearly important as well to ensure long-term health. Beyond that, the assessments are now being able to use, satellite observations can now be used to derive parameters like pH of the water. So this is work which is led by ETH in Zurich in Switzerland. And here they're using satellite observations of salinity and temperature in particular to allow them to estimate alkalinity and interpolate the PCO2 data, the same data which is used for the flux assessment. And the combination of those two allow them then to recalculate the whole carbonate system, and so you can derive pH. And this allows you to track pH through time, globally and regionally, and these kind of approaches are now being used to advise resource managers in the west coast of the United States, for example, but also for raising awareness and the kind of plight of the ocean. And we're also working with groups in the Western Pacific to use these data to help guide their decision making as well. And so the kind of things you can get from that is it means you can now actually plot ocean pH. These stripes, these are the kind of thing that you could see for sea surface temperature or air temperature. You can now do exactly the same for pH. And this is all based upon satellite observations in conjunction with in situ data, of course. But these are, my personal feeling is these really are the tip of the iceberg of what is possible. And there's been 2 review papers that were published in the 2020 and 2021, which identified how the importance of satellite observations was actually increasing with time and kind of a review of what was possible, what has been done so far. And then there are 2 more papers that came out this year, identifying the advances that have been made in just those 4 years between those 2 reviews, but also now what is possible and where the efforts should be focused for supporting science, but also for supporting policy and mitigation in terms of for ocean acidification, for example. But almost all these studies are already focusing on the surface. We are observing the surface from space, but just focusing on what surface properties are, or surface chemistry, or surface physics. But you can use these observations also for looking vertically through the ocean and understanding what happens within the water column and also the vertical flows and potentially the internal flows of the ocean. So this on the left, on the right here, we have 2 examples. This is work showing Ekman pumping in the Southern Ocean. And the one on the right is actually the Ekman pumping due to a hurricane as it tracked across the Atlantic. And these are estimates of the flows, the vertical flows, driven by an understanding of winds and Coriolis force and the pressure gradient acceleration forces at the ocean surface, which allows you then to calculate the flows. And early work by Peter van Shutler used kind of reanalysis to do this, but work by Ifremer in France shows you can now use satellite observations to do the same thing. But it's possible that you can do much more with those. We've had recent SWAT satellite, which was launched, I think, a year and a half ago. It's designed to look at the water cycle. And so the very technique itself is measuring as observing surface flows of water, which means you can start to do a lot more than just using wind-based data, which is about inferring a wind speed based upon surface roughness. Here they're actually using a technique to actually observe the flow of the water at the surface. So I think we're reaching a point now where we can start to use satellite observations for more than just looking at the surface constituents. And there should be approaches where you can start to look at internal flows. And so this is what I wanted to really talk about in terms of our recent work, is that we've actually started to use some existing data to try and understand and kind of push what is possible from these surface observations. So we were particularly interested in shelf seas. So these are regions where the water depth is dropping to or reducing to about 200 meters deep. So we're looking at the shelf edge as it's coming from the open ocean across the shelf. And we're particularly interested in these because they're important carbon sinks and important, but they're incredibly important for food production and the majority of the population lives around coastlines. 90% of seafood comes from shelf seas. And so they're offering a range of these services from food through to well-being, but also clearly transport and recreation. And there was some work done in 2018, which was published by L'Oreal in Nature Climate Change, I think, but they identified that these shelf seas were increasing, variable but increasing sinks of CO2. And this is their work. They showed, you can see that areas of red means that it's more an increasing sink. And so you can see a large number of these shelf seas are actually increasing in their strength. And they hypothesized that there were two possible reasons that were actually driving this change. One was the potential imbalance between the exchange at the surface and then the export at depth. So the kind of removal of that carbon at depth off of the shelf sea, or whether there had been or is an evolution of the biological pump on the shelf itself, predominantly driven by anthropogenic introduction of nutrients. They offered these two hypotheses to explain this observation they made. And so we wanted to try and see whether we could see any evidence of the first one. So here we're looking at the differences in exchange at the surface and whether there's any control with the export of the water at depth. And we knew from the previous work, so this is work that I showed earlier on, where this particular work actually identified that winter weather was controlling the net influx of CO2 into the water. So we were conscious that we also had to think about not only just the annual processes, but maybe there was a seasonal component which was significant or important within that. So we took a relatively simplistic approach. We knew from mass balance that if you have water flowing onto the shelf, clearly it can't just flood the land. It gets trapped in some ways, and therefore the water flowing on to the shelf in some ways is related to the water flowing back off again. And it's really the water flow back off that we're interested in to understand the accumulation of carbon within the shelf seas. So our idea was that if we make a bunch of quite simplistic assumptions about the water flowing onto the shelf being within the mixed layer, and we look at the flows at the shelf edge, of the different components of that flow, whether that be Ekman, geostrophic, and waves or wave-driven Stokes drift flows are the three we looked at. If we can understand what those three components are doing, can we then understand how they relate to the carbon accumulation? And this allows us to test part of that. The first hypothesis is the export flow important for accumulation rates. So for this piece of work, we used some data from the Glob Current data set. This is a European Space Agency project, which used a combined model observation or model estimates with a global observations from satellites for geostrophic and Ekman flows. And they used those to combine to produce a total current flow, which is what you can see here with these the worms kind of whizzing across the screen. But they provide currents at two different depths, and it's split into Ekman and geostrophic and a combined version. And so it's an observational based reanalysis data set. So that we had our flows and we had some estimate of the mixed layer depth from observational based reanalysis again as well. But now we need to identify our actual shelf edges. Where was that flow actually occurring onto the shelf? So for this, we used a computer vision approach where we followed the contours of the GEBCO bathymetry data set. And using a line tracking algorithm, you can then split that into segments, and you can then work out for each segment the normal vector that goes onto the shelf. And we did that based upon tracking two different contours, two different depth contours, and then working out the normal line between those two different contours. And if you increase the resolution of your line tracking and reduce the size of your segments, it means you can then end up with this detailed description of all of the normal vectors that are crossing your shelf edge going onto the shelf, which is what you can see here with the colored lines around the European shelf. And if you have that, you can then align that with your data set of interest, and it means you can extract all of the data points along the shelf edge to understand what current flows and components you have occurring within the mixed layer depth that are crossing that shelf region. And in fact, you can do that globally. So this is our kind of an image of the global data set we had for all of the normal vectors of all the shelf seas in the whole, across the whole world. But we were focusing on just the ones that Lario paper focused on. So if you then do that, and you can extract your Ekman versus geostrophic data, you can then work out which ones are dominating and where are they dominating. So this is an example. You can see the boxes are all the shelf seas that we wanted to study. And then the color determines, indicates whether they're dominated by geostrophic flows or Ekman flows. And you can see that they vary depending on the shelf sea and position, and they also vary through time. So it's not a constant process. So clearly, it's important to consider both Ekman and geostrophic, depending on your shelf sea and the time of year in which you're trying to study. You can also do the same for waves. So we used a wave reanalysis data set, the WaveWatch 3 reanalysis, to look at our Stokes drift component. And we then did a similar ratio where we took the Stokes drift component to in relation to the geostrophic and Ekman sum, the sum of those two. And then this identifies where your wave action becomes important. And the waves they're relatively small impact because the impact reduces exponentially with depth. So they're only really influenced or applied when you have low wind conditions and stable, relatively stable seas in terms of wind, and then the wave action can actually come through. But again, it shows that wave action can be important, but it's really highly regional and temporally variable. And because we were extracting the values all along the shelf edge, it means you can then compare the different components in terms of the distance you travel along the shelf. So this is an example for the Mid-Atlantic bight, and you can see the different ocean current components. So we've got blue is geostrophic, green is the Ekman process, and then orange is Stokes, the waves. So you can see as you travel along the shelf edge, you're getting different combination and strength of different current components within that mixed layer that are traveling onto the shelf. And then if you then compare this, for example, with one of the plots from the Lario paper, where they were showing how the different carbon accumulation rates vary along the shelf, you can immediately is obvious here is that, is there a link between the flows going onto the shelf or off the shelf in relation to carbon accumulation? And this kind of variability along shelf edges is not unique to the Mid-Atlantic bight. You can, this is the equivalent set of plots of the European shelf seas. And so you can see that there's this, as you move along the shelf, different components of flow become important within the mixed layer depth. So what we then did was we took our flows and we compared them, we evaluated them, regressed them against the accumulation rates of carbon that were from the L'Oreal paper. And we looked at annual signals and there wasn't anything there. We looked at the gas exchange coefficient as well as the flows. And we had a whole array, I think something like 25 or 30 different sort of evaluations based through this regression analysis. And the only signal we identified was that if the absolute mean wintertime shelf break Ekman currents was related to the accumulation rates. And this was the only significant relationship. The others were all non-significant that we found. But it implies that there is a significant link between, a causal link between the Ekman flows coming onto the shelf and the accumulation rates in wintertime, which is consistent with what we saw with the Cadesis paper, where they identified that the exchange at the surface was important for the uptake of carbon within the shelf sea, but only during wintertime. And if you look at autumn and repeat the same analysis, we also identified a significant relationship there. It was not as strong, but the same signal appears to exist. So this work appears to show that autumn and wind-driven incursions of water onto the shelf seas from these Ekman processes are consistent with this accumulation of carbon and acidification rates within these shelf seas. And it does provide the first observational-based evidence of this water flow mechanism, where the export of water is in some way controlling the strength of these shelf carbon sinks and their evolution. And it also doesn't suggest that models, if you want to use a model to estimate how the ocean health in the shelf sea, but also its likely evolution through time, that they really need to consider resolving these cross-shelf flows. Otherwise, this whole, this signal, this process would be completely missed. And it does also re-emphasize, reinforce the previous advice that if you want to encourage sort of prolonged long-term health of these shelf seas, then reducing atmospheric global emissions is really key, because the biological processes again seem to be the secondary controller, where we have control over nutrients going into the sea, whereas this physics-based abiotic process appears to be more dominant. So I just wanted to end on talking about something which was related, but also slightly different. And whilst it's really, I'm very excited and very pro Shutler observations, and I think they're an amazing sort of gift, I guess, that we can use for understanding the climate, and monitoring the climate in particular, and understanding and furthering science and the study of the oceans. I am also conscious that there has to be this balancing act. Clearly, if we want to put something into space, it's going to have an impact on the environment, and so we need to be aware of that. And this is some work that we have been doing, where we've identified there's this clear exponential increase in the amount of space activity. And for example, in 2010, we were only seeing about 74 rockets worldwide being launched, and there were a majority of those were with space agencies, so groups like NASA or European Space Agency. But in 2022, it was 180 launches in 1 year, and then last year it was up to 223. And the majority of these have been driven by commercial activities rather than agencies. And we did a review around this, and clearly there's lots of ways in which these activities are actually influencing the environment, particularly the atmospheric environment, but also climate. There's obviously the rocket itself. The carbon emissions are relatively small, oddly, but the chemical impacts and the things that they introduce into the atmosphere are very wide, sweeping, and can be quite large. So there's impacts here which are negatively impacting climate. There's aspects which are can destroy ozone as well. And along with that, they have the ability also to contract the upper atmosphere. So carbon dioxide emitted in the upper atmosphere actually causes it to contract, which means that satellites, for example, that we put into orbit are likely to stay there longer because they're not being pulled back down by gravity as much. So these are aspects, as an Earth observation community, we need to kind of be aware of. But in particular for Earth observation, we also need to consider the fact that the impacts are not just in the atmosphere, they are also at ground level. So this on the plot here, this on the left-hand side, this is a plot of the increasing amount of growth of Earth observation satellites and constellations that are in space. And you can clearly see this upward trend as time goes on, and large portions of those are driven by commercial activities. And then on the right-hand side, this is a plot, a map of all the different ground stations and data centers, which hold data across the world. And clearly, it's pretty widespread and very distributed. And so this particular piece, which was published early this year, last month, identifies that Earth observation clearly is really important for transforming our understanding and the state and trajectories of Earth's environment, and so clearly very beneficial and worthwhile. But the current mushrooming of Earth observation satellites in particular, and the resultant data that are being stored, both that's new data but also the archiving of existing data, is hitting a point now where we have to really consider its impact on the environment as well. So many of these data centers which are storing data, they're duplicating data as well as storing new data. And many of them are also located in places which are producing large amounts of emissions because of their energy mix, but they also have large requirements on water. And many of the data centers are actually located in areas of water scarcity. So it means they're putting this extra pressure on the environment along with the emissions that they're producing. And in some ways, Earth observation in this sense is a small component of these data centers' activity. But I do think that, personally, I think that we can use Earth observation to kind of shine a light on this issue, essentially because the data centers, they're also being used for things like Facebook and social media for much larger quantities. But again, they're suffering from the same problems. They're holding data and located in areas of water scarcity, and they have very high emissions associated with them. There is an opportunity here for the Earth observation community to actually use this as a way of highlighting this issue. So that's all I wanted to talk about. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Questions from anyone? Tony has his hand up. I'll let him go ahead.
Hi, Jamie. Thank you very much for the very interesting seminar. The question about the whether there's any requirement for spatial temporal sampling need to better estimate the cross-shelf transport.
So do you mean this is for the Shelf C work?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we were doing it on a monthly estimates with the evaluation itself is around about 25 kilometer spatial resolution.
Mm-hmm.
The data are monthly.
Mm-hmm. So
and then I can't remember the resolution of the underlying water, the PCO2 data from L'Oreal work, but they have two different resolutions. But we're essentially sampling both the resolutions relevant to those processes and then evaluating them jointly.
Mm-hmm. And would the estimate be improved with higher spatial temporal resolution, or the existing estimates are sufficient in terms of sampling?
I think it's possible that the signal would become stronger at a higher temporal resolution. But I think because the signal we're picking up, because it's a signal that exists over a long period of time, over the winter, so it's a 3 month long, the signal's coming from 3 months worth of data. then I suspect that it would just strengthen it rather than change the result. But it's possible, I think, with the subtle observations that we could push it down to 8-day analyses rather than monthly. So that would be one way of extending it, yeah.
And the spatial resolution is less of an issue in the accuracy of the estimate, is it? Like whether you have a quarter degree versus 10 kilometer, for example.
Yes. So there has been some modeling work where they showed that you needed a high resolution model to actually resolve a lot of the shelf break currents. But we're certainly seeing those signals within the 25-kilometer data. So.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Are there other questions? Maybe while people are thinking, Tony asked what was at the forefront of my mind. I was wondering also, there's been some modeling work that has really pointed to the role of tides in governing cross-shelf exchange around Antarctica. I'd wondered if you thought a little about what tides might do, if they could be added in artificially and if they would make a difference, or are they just sloshing things back and forth in a way that doesn't have a net effect?
Yeah, so unfortunately, the data we're using had the tidal oscillations were removed. They weren't present. So we weren't able to kind of assess that. And so I think the answer is I don't know. It's possible that like you say, the sloshing backwards and forwards would over time average out, but we weren't. It wasn't clear to us how we could actually kind of test that. So it's an open question at the moment.
Has there been any thought of trying to do the analysis with something like the LLC 4320 model that has very hourly fields at pretty high resolution and some tidal energy?
Yes, that is something we could do. We haven't thought about doing that, no, currently. It took us, because we were pretty keen to use an observational-based data set, and the processing of those data globally took quite a long time.
I can imagine.
Yeah. So but yes, definitely that is something we could do in the future. Yeah. And that may help us pull out the signal of the tides as well.
Well, if I can change gears to ask about the issue you raised at the end, you mentioned water impacts of ground stations. Can you clarify what you mean by that? What's the issue?
Yeah, so a lot of these data centers use water for cooling.
Okay.
And so they, for example, they might be located in a desert, and so they're using water for cooling, but clearly water is of a resource which isn't, is not very abundant, and so that puts additional pressures on the environment they're in. Not all of them are, but the bigger problem is that they don't necessarily tell you how their cloud system is being operated. So I think some providers are starting to tell you something about the emissions profile and the energy mix that they're using, but they aren't. There are very few of them, and in fact, none of them that I know of so far are actually telling you anything about their other environmental impacts. And so part of this work is really highlighting the need for users of data centers to ask, but also for data centers themselves to be much more open about how they're using their resources and what quantities they're using and what efforts they're taking to try and reduce their environmental impact.
Do you have any sense of what the right strategy is? Where should we be headed in this regard?
But I think there's lots of things we can do. For a recent project bid, we actually found a data provider who was using a data center that is 100% based upon 100% renewable electricity, for example. But I think a lot of it is about storing less. Do we really need to store all of these data? Are there amounts of data that can be stored offline rather than being held online constantly? Should we be purging our data regularly? Should we consider how we are generating data and kind of our uses of things like cloud computing for video calls, for example? And so there are lots of ways in which we can reduce our impacts. And particularly my university is terrible. We use Teams, and they as far as I know, they don't purge the data. They collate everything back through time. So there's logs of communications and talks that happened 2, 3, 4 years ago. Do we really need them? I think we could very easily reduce our loading just by deleting old things that we have no use for.
Right. Historians might have a field day with everything we've archived if they can make sense of it. But from a forward-looking standpoint, we're archiving way more than we'll ever need.
Yes, exactly.
Other questions? If not, maybe we'll thank you for a really great and interesting talk. It's got us thinking about a lot of issues, and thank everyone for coming.
Thanks so much, Sarah.
Really appreciate it.
Thank
for
you,
the
Jamie.
invite. No worries.
Bye.